So why doesn't Rome just abandon Purgatory? Well, obviously because if Purgatory disappears, Rome, the whole system falls apart.
You know, we're watching a lot of stuff. Roman Catholicism again, trying to catch up. And it is interesting to see Roman Catholicism do what it's always done. And Roman Catholicism is a product of its environment. And what I mean by that is that it morphs and it changes. It's kind of like a chameleon. Whatever country it's in, whatever regime it's under, whoever the current pope is at the time, Roman Catholicism takes the shape of its surrounding circumstances. Obviously, for instance, if you were to see Roman Catholicism in South America, you'd see liberation theology. If you were to see Roman Catholicism in Mexico, you'd say the same thing, but there'd be a different spin on it. Right? Mexican Catholicism is much different from what you would find in Italy, and then Italian Roman Catholicism, what you would see at the Vatican and the worship and the style there would be different than what you see here in America, right? Because America has been heavily influenced by Protestantism and liberalism, leftism, postmodernism. So it is interesting just to see Roman Catholicism more throughout the days and the years and the decades. And right now, it's definitely got a leftist, progressive, almost universalistic stance to it. And one of the ways you can tell is that I've been seeing a lot of people, for instance, Catholic Answers. I was watching or looking at one of their Instagram posts the other day, and they posted some verses speaking about purgatory, proofs for purgatory, or at least proofs for premises about purgatory. And the verses they provided obviously had nothing to do with purgatory, did not prove purgatory, did not offer any credence to the idea of purgatory. The presupposition of purgatory wasn't there, but it doesn't matter to them, because obviously sola ecclesia, they get to define what Scripture says and what it means. But the interesting thing about that is that purgatory, whereas it used to be obviously understood for almost the entirety of Rome or Roman Catholicism as being temporal, right? You went there, you would wear the scapula. If you wore the scapula when you died, Mary would come and let you out of purgatory the Saturday after your death, right? So there's a temporal progression to that. And things like indulgences that were being sold during the time of Martin Luther were obviously being sold so you could reduce the time that your family member, right, your wife or your husband or your children or your parents or whoever, you could reduce their time in purgatory by buying indulgences, and it would take time off of their prison sentence in purgatory. Now, how much time was taken off? Well, you don't know. It's really undefined, but it was obvious that there was a temporal progression, and Rome has always taught this until recently. Obviously, after it's hard to pinpoint, but probably Vatican II was the launching point for that. It's very leftist, progressive, to the left side of the aisle swing, so to say. Really, this postmodern idea of relativism and non-truth. But that it is interesting to see Roman Catholic apologists, especially those like Catholic Answers, who argue that, the Catholic Church has been the same for 2,000 years. The Catholic dogma has never changed. That this has always been what has been taught. To watch them so obviously and just pathetically, and I'm using that very descriptively, not derogatorily, they're very pathetic attempts to just whitewash all of the history before and to say, well, Rome has never made a declaration on the temporality of purgatory. It could just be instant. We don't really know. Rome has never said. It's just such a ridiculous statement and so pathetic. And if you're a Roman Catholic and you're watching this, and you're somebody at Catholic Answers watching this, just know this is why Protestants look at you and go, you're always just making this up on the fly as you go along, as the decades roll along. Because Rome used to say something, and they actually said this one for, over a millennia, they taught that it was temporal. But now we got this new pope who's an inclusivist at the very least. He's very left-swinging and all that. Well, now we're going to pretend that, well, it may not have an actual temporal duration. It might be instant. We don't know if the church has never said. Well, the church did say the church sold indulgences. People wear the scapular for a reason. It's so obvious to anybody, even on the outside, just looking in. When you do things like this and you contradict yourself and contradict the church, you have to backpedal, make all the excuses, use all the analogies and say, well, we didn't really say dogmatically, or we didn't really actually say this. Well, there wasn't a papal bull about that. Okay, sure. If you say so. But we all know what's really going on.
So why doesn't Rome just abandon Purgatory? Well, obviously because if Purgatory disappears, Rome, the whole system falls apart. Right? Because Purgatory is that thing standing in between you and Jesus. That you can't get through it on your own. Right? There's no way to get through Purgatory through works, or through prayer, or through anything that you can do on your own. So you need the church, the ultimate argument for authority. Because you need the church, you need the sacerdotal priesthood in order to help ferry you through. Because you can't get to heaven on your own. The church is the only way to heaven. So you have to serve the church faithfully your whole life. And even if you do that, you're still going to go to purgatory unless you're a saint. Well, how do you know if you're a saint? Well, you got to wait until after you're dead, and then Rome has to decide if they want to make you a saint, and then it takes time, sometimes not till hundreds of thousands of years later. And then maybe some of your merits will go into the treasury of merit, right? And then those can be doled out to other people. So the whole system breaks down. Purgatory disappears. So purgatory is never going to disappear. It's always going to be there because they need that as a scare tactic in order to keep people in Roman Catholicism and a slave to the system. And that's the main reason. This is the reason history and understanding history, how to interpret properly, is so important. Now, I'm definitely glad that I decided to get my bachelor's in history, because that was probably one of the smartest things I ever did. And I've heard over and over again people say,
especially people in the Reform camp, that the two things that have helped them the most, church history and Greek. And that's definitely true. And the nice thing about studying history is that where I see errors with apologists in general, but specifically Roman Catholic apologists, is that they're dogmaticians, right? They're there to defend Roman Catholic dogma, the magisterium, the papacy, the whole argument from authority. They're there to defend the church. They're not there to make historical inquiries. They're not there to look at history properly. When I investigate history, I do it almost as if I'm an atheist. That's how I like to approach most things. I like to approach a topic in history as a skeptic almost, because that helps remove your bias. Now, everybody has bias. It's impossible to get rid of it totally, obviously, and I would never argue that. But for Rome, their historical analysis is filtered through the lens that whatever the church has said, well, at least whatever they say the church has said. The church said a lot of things. It made a lot of statements, but obviously looking back at history, they take what they have now and they say, well, that wasn't a dogmatic statement. Well, that wasn't an official pronouncement. Well, there was some papal bull there. Obviously, like I said, Roman Catholicism molds to the environment it's in. But it's just very helpful to look at it almost from a skeptical perspective, because that helps you to investigate history in a truthful and proper manner. Now, when I look at history, for instance, I'll look at the Reformers, right? Obviously, Reformed theologian. I like to look at the Protestant Reformers. 16th century, 17th century, very, very big. Obviously, I look at Martin Luther, 1570. Well, a lot of people look at Martin Luther and him nailing the door, the 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg. And people will say, look at this man. What a powerful, courageous, strong man who's defying the Roman Catholic Church. And you'll see paintings of him with a hammer that almost looks like he stole from Thor in the Avengers. And he's hammering this massive nail, almost as if it's a nail used in a crucifixion. He's pounded it in. Sometimes he'll have a huge muscle. Like, it's just, obviously, and people will look at that and go, he was defying the church. Well, no, it was a big moment. But for Luther, it was just another day. He was putting his 95 thesis, or his 95 debate points, or his 95 objections up, because he wanted to debate them. There was no internet, there was no YouTube. So if you wanted to become famous, or if you wanted precedence, or if you wanted your idea to gain traction, you debated, formal debates. And that's what he was doing. So Luther, even though by 1517 he was already struggling with doubts with Rome and its authority and what he had seen and experienced, he still considered himself a Roman Catholic. So this idea that he was, that he was vying against Rome and he was making this stand against Roman Catholicism, that he was breaking away from the church, well, that would eventually happen, but it didn't happen at that moment. He probably didn't have a massive mallet. He probably didn't look like Thor. And so you need to understand Martin Luther in light of who he was in history, and you need to do that faithfully and truthfully and historically. That's a good lesson for Roman Catholics, especially their apologists and those at Catholic Answers, because their rose-colored glasses are extremely thick. Everything is filtered through what Rome says, and even if it's at odds or contradictory with history and fact, it doesn't matter because Rome has spoken, and that leads to errors like Purgatory. I'm going to make a much more in-depth video on Purgatory sometime this next week, and I'm going to look at what Catholic Answers said on their Instagram, some of the passages they provide, and then we're going to see if Scripture actually does teach that. But I think it's good just to get you thinking about how to think about how to think about how to process, think about how to be systematic in your understanding when approaching any topic, especially history. So I'll wrap it up here in a minute, but just remember that, Purgatory is obviously something that developed over time. And you'll hear Roman Catholic apologists say time and time again, it's been here since the beginning, and they'll look back at history, and they'll try to find a reference here, or a vague analogy here, or a metaphor here. Or what happens a lot of times is they'll actually find a heretic, they'll find a Gnostic, or they'll look at a Pelagian, or they'll look at, somebody from 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. They'll look at the Council of Nicaea and look at Arianism, or some other false form of Christianity. They'll say, well, see, there it is right there. There's a reference here, or there's a mention here. Somebody said something that sounds vaguely like this. Well, I don't know if you want your official church dogmatic statements to be based in history on heresy. If it can't be found in Scripture, if you can't find actual direct references in Scripture, then it's not biblical and henceforth not Christianity. You can go ahead and ignore it. You don't need it. It's got nothing to do with the Christ. Right now, it's not like the Christ. It has nothing to do with Christ and His church, and it never has. You don't need it. You don't need purgatory because it's not real.